The maintenance. The hospital called it maintenance. The old texts called it rebirth. The building stood apart from the city, isolated by design rather than distance. Its windows were narrow and tinted, reflecting nothing of the storm that pressed against its concrete skin. Rain slid down the glass in slow, deliberate streaks, blurring the outside world until the hospital seemed to exist alone, detached from ordinary time. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and cold metal. The lights did not flicker, yet they felt unstable, as if they could dim without warning. At the end of the restricted corridor lay Room 7, a single-occupancy chamber designated for high-security medical interventions. No nameplate, no schedule. Only a red indicator light above the door, glowing steadily, announcing that the procedure had begun. Aurelian Cade lay inside that room. Once, his body had been synonymous with discipline and control. A generation had learned to associate his movements with balance, precision, and restraint. Now medical reports described him in language stripped of reverence. Degenerative damage, systemic fatigue, prognosis uncertain. According to the doctors, the hardware had failed. Elara Cade stood outside the sealed door, her reflection fractured in the polished steel wall. She had been given a badge marked Visitor, followed by a number instead of a name. 15 minutes. That was the limit. Not because of emotional strain. Not because of privacy. Because of protocol. They told her it was routine. A nurse, expression neutral, explained that the intervention required strict environmental control. Family presence could interfere with recovery metrics. Emotional fluctuations were considered variables. Variables were risks. Elara listened, nodded, and signed where she was told. The pen felt heavier than it should have. When the door finally opened, the room inside was almost bare. No machines visible beyond a single monitor embedded into the wall. No tubes. No wires. Aurelian lay still, his breathing shallow but steady. His skin carried a faint pallor, not the gray of illness, but something closer to wax. She spoke his name once. There was no response. Her time ended before she realized it had begun. As the door closed again, Elara noticed something that did not fit. The digital clock above the corridor froze, its numbers locked at 3 in the morning. No alarm sounded. No one reacted. Moments later, it resumed counting as if nothing had happened. Downstairs in a secured wing inaccessible to visitors, a different set of documents circulated. They did not reference Aurelian by name. They listed dates aligned not with medical necessity, but with astronomical markers. Solstices. Lunar crossings. Precise intervals measured long before modern hospitals existed. One page bore a handwritten note, added after the file had already been approved. Naming is required to complete the cycle. No signature followed. Outside, the rain intensified, washing the city clean of witnesses. Inside Room 7, the red indicator light dimmed, then shifted to white. The procedure had concluded. The doctors would later report success, carefully avoiding the word healed. And, behind sterile doors, something ancient adjusted, as if recognizing that a threshold had been crossed and a debt quietly acknowledged. What they sealed behind sterile doors was never meant to stay contained. The project. Beneath the white coats. Morning did not soften the hospital. Daylight only made its geometry clearer. The corridors were too straight, the corners too sharp, the silence too disciplined. Outside Room 7, the red light that had burned through the night was gone. In its place was a clean white glow, the kind used to signal completion. Elara returned with the same badge and the same number. The same rule: 15 minutes. This time, the staff did not pretend the limitation was temporary. It was presented as a permanent feature of the process. A young administrator, polite to the point of coldness, explained that Aurelian's recovery depended on controlled inputs and stable emotional conditions. When Elara asked what that meant in plain language, the administrator smiled, as if the question were slightly embarrassing. "It means we reduce variables," he said. "We keep him safe." Safe was a word that could cover anything. Through the narrow window in the door, Elara saw Aurelian sitting upright for the first time in months. His posture was straight, his shoulders squared. His eyes were open, focused on a point somewhere beyond the walls. His hands rested calmly on his knees, as if he were meditating, as if he were simply waiting. There were still no visible machines, no drip line, no catheter, no tubes taped to his skin. Only that embedded monitor, its pulse line moving with a steady rhythm that felt too composed to belong to a man who had been labeled fragile. When Elara entered, a nurse stood between her and the bed, measuring distance the way security measures threats. Aurelian turned his head slowly. His gaze landed on Elara and stayed there, unblinking. For a moment she felt relief, sharp enough to hurt. Then he spoke. "Do not stand too close," he said. His voice was low and controlled, but it did not sound like it belonged to a patient. It sounded like an instruction, rehearsed under pressure. Elara froze. "What did you say?" Aurelian glanced toward the nurse, then back to Elara. "It is not safe." The nurse stepped forward quickly, her smile practiced. "He is disoriented," she said, as if narrating a routine symptom. Sometimes patients experience temporary confusion after deep sedation. Deep sedation, with no tubes, no scars, no apparent after-effects. Elara tried to take Aurelian's hand. The nurse's fingers tightened around Elara's wrist with professional gentleness. Not a grip that bruised, but one that clearly communicated authority. "Please," the nurse said. "We need to follow protocol." Elara withdrew her hand and watched Aurelian's face. His expression remained calm, almost serene. Yet something in his eyes seemed slightly misaligned, as if he were watching her from a distance that had nothing to do with space. The visit ended on schedule. The door sealed again. The white indicator light stayed steady. On the way out, Elara noticed a detail she had missed before. A second corridor, branching off from the restricted wing, blocked by a door with no handle, only a keypad and a metal plate, engraved with a single word. Palingenesis. The label was not medical. It was not a department name. It was too old, too deliberate, as if the word itself carried weight that could not be translated into a modern explanation. Elara asked a passing staff member what it meant. The man did not answer. He did not even slow down. He walked as if he had not heard her at all. The only person who finally spoke was Dr. Josef Varn. He appeared late that afternoon in a conference room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and warm circuitry. He did not wear a white coat. His suit was dark and unwrinkled, his tie perfectly centered. He looked less like a physician and more like a man assigned to speak carefully. He placed a folder on the table. Elara saw her husband's name in small print on the corner, along with a string of numbers that resembled a case designation. "You are concerned," Varn said. It was not a question. "I am being kept away from my husband," Elara replied. "I am being told to accept it as routine." "It is not routine." Varn opened the folder without hesitation. Inside were diagrams that looked like medical imaging overlays. Cellular structures, regeneration pathways, notes about protein synthesis and immune modulation. The words were dense, technical, and almost hypnotic in their specificity. "This is a controlled intervention," Varn said. "We support tissue repair. We stabilize systemic inflammation. We reduce autoimmune volatility. We rebuild." Elara listened, waiting for the part that would explain the 15 minutes. The locked doors, the absence of equipment, the strange calm in Aurelian's voice. Varn continued as if reading from a script. "Your husband is a public figure. He requires privacy. He also requires a level of care that most facilities cannot provide." "You mean expensive care?" Varn did not deny it. "Privileged care," he corrected. "The kind that attracts rumors. That is why we keep the process contained. The more people involved, the more noise leaks out." Elara leaned forward. "I saw a door. It said palingenesis." At that, something in Varn's expression shifted. Not fear, not guilt. A brief tightening around the eyes, as if he had been reminded of a rule. "It is the project name," he said. "A working term." "What does it mean?" Varn's pause was short, but it was real. "Rebirth," he said finally. "In the strictest sense of the word." Elara felt the air in the room grow thinner. "That is not medical language." Varn closed the folder, then opened a different section. This one was not diagrams. It was a schedule. Dates arranged in precise intervals. Columns of numbers. Notations that did not resemble dosage or lab results. They looked disturbingly like a calendar built around a logic that did not belong to hospitals. Elara pointed at a line. "What is this?" "Synchronization," Varn said. "With what?" Varn's voice remained calm. "With natural cycles." Elara stared at him. "What cycles?" He met her eyes, unflinching. "The ones that cannot be negotiated." She left the conference room with more questions than answers. In the hallway outside, a maintenance cart sat unattended. On its top shelf lay a stack of paper forms, partially covered by a towel. One page was visible, printed in small official font. It listed donors, not by name, by code. And in the margin, written by hand in the same careful ink Elara had seen before, were 4 words that made her throat tighten. "Naming is required to complete the cycle." Elara looked up sharply, expecting someone to be watching. The corridor was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere behind locked doors, Aurelian Cade's heart kept a steady rhythm, as if it had never faltered. Elara folded the page, slid it into her bag, and walked away with her pulse rising, aware that she had just taken something she was never meant to touch. That night, when she returned home, she searched for the word palingenesis on her own. The results were shallow. Definitions. Academic references. Nothing that matched the hospital's secrecy. Then she found a scanned image buried deep in an archive. A brittle page from an old text, its ink faded, its margins crowded with annotations. The passage spoke of renewal as a contract. It described a door that could be closed only if a name was offered. Not a nickname, not a title. A true name, spoken with intention. Elara shut her laptop and sat in silence, listening to the rain begin again. In the early hours before dawn, she dreamed of a corridor that did not exist, lined with doors that had no handles. In the dream, a voice whispered from the other side of one door, slow and patient, as if reciting an instruction learned long ago. When she woke, her phone was on the floor beside the bed, screen lit. A message had arrived from an unknown number. It contained no greeting, no explanation. Only a date and a time, followed by a single sentence. "Meet me if you want to know why the calendar is not medical." Elara stared at the screen until the letters blurred. And somewhere, deep beneath the hospital, a schedule waited on a table, its lines drawn with a precision that had nothing to do with healing. The schedule did not follow medicine. It followed the sky. The uncounted. The address led Elara to the edge of the city where infrastructure thinned and the lights became uncertain. The building she arrived at had once been a municipal records office. Its windows were boarded, its signage stripped away. Only a single lamp above the entrance remained lit, casting a weak cone of yellow onto the wet pavement. She entered alone. Inside, the air was stale, layered with dust and the faint odor of paper that had not been touched in years. A man waited near the back of the room, standing beside a folding table stacked with folders bound by string. He did not give his name. He did not ask for hers. He only nodded as if acknowledging an inevitability. "You should not have taken the page," he said. Elara did not deny it. "Then tell me why it exists." The man pulled one folder free and opened it. Inside were lists, dates, codes, notations that mirrored the page Elara had found at the hospital. But these went back years, decades. Each entry marked with a symbol instead of a signature. "They call them contributors," he said. "They do not call them patients." Elara's breath caught. Contributors to what? The man slid a photograph across the table. It showed a group of young people standing in front of a rural clinic. The building behind them was modest, its paint peeling, its windows clouded. The faces in the photo were ordinary. Students. Laborers. People whose absence would not immediately make headlines. They were told they were donating samples, the man continued. Blood, plasma, stem material. Enough to pay debts. Enough to earn favors. Enough to believe it was temporary. Elara recognized the pattern now. They never came back. The man's silence was confirmation. He opened another folder. Inside was a map, its edges creased from repeated folding. Several villages were circled in red. Others were crossed out entirely. "These locations no longer exist in official records," he said. "The buildings remain. The people do not." Elara stared at the map. "What happened to them?" "They were drained in stages," he replied. "Not all at once. That would draw attention. The process requires continuity, rhythm." She thought of the schedules. The dates aligned with solstices and lunar cycles. The word synchronization echoed in her mind. "This is not medicine," she said. "No," the man agreed. "It is logistics." He reached for another photograph. This one showed a laboratory interior. Stainless steel surfaces, centrifuges, storage units labeled with alphanumeric codes. At the edge of the frame, barely visible, was a chalk marking on the floor. A symbol Elara recognized from the scanned text she had found the night before. Rebirth as a contract. "They believe life can be transferred," the man said. "Not metaphorically, literally. That vitality can be moved, stabilized, and anchored in a prepared body." "Aurelian," Elara whispered. "He is an ideal vessel," the man said. "Disciplined. Conditioned. Already revered." His survival justifies the cost. Ilara felt anger surge, sharp and sudden. Cost to whom? The man did not answer directly. Instead, he pulled out a final document. This one was different. It was not a list or a map. It was a ledger. Each page showed a balance. On one side were names reduced to codes. On the other were outcomes: recovery, stabilization, extension. The numbers never matched. There was always a remainder. What happens when the balance is off? Ilara asked. The man closed the ledger. They adjust. Ilara left the building before dawn, her mind struggling to keep pace with what she had learned. The city was quiet, unaware that its brightest symbol was being sustained by subtraction. She returned home and tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw the ledger, its uneven columns demanding correction. At the hospital, Aurelian's recovery accelerated. Within days, he was walking unassisted. Within a week, his physicians reported metrics that defied expectation. Muscle density increased. Inflammation markers dropped. Neurological responses sharpened. The language used in his charts grew cautious, then reverent. Ilara was allowed her 15 minutes. No more. During one visit, she noticed faint markings on Aurelian's inner wrist. Not scars. Impressions as if something had been pressed into the skin and removed. "What is that?" she asked. Aurelian looked down, then covered his wrist with his sleeve. "It helps me remember," he said. "Remember what?" He hesitated. For the first time, something like strain crossed his face. "That I am not alone," he said. "Even when I am." Ilara felt a chill. "Do you hear them?" Aurelian did not answer immediately. His gaze drifted toward the ceiling, unfocused. "Sometimes," he said, "when it is quiet." That night, Ilara received another message. This one contained a single attachment, a video file recorded inside the hospital. The angle was poor, the image grainy. It showed a lower-level corridor, unmarked and heavily secured. Along its walls were doors identical to Room 7. Each door bore a number. The camera panned slowly. One door stood open. Inside, a young man lay on a narrow bed, his chest rising shallowly. Tubes ran from his arms into a machine humming softly. A technician adjusted a dial, watching a gauge marked transfer rate. Then the camera cut to another room. This one was empty. The bed was stripped. The sheets folded neatly. The monitor dark. The message ended with a single line of text. "They do not waste anything." Ilara stood in the darkness of her living room, phone shaking in her hand. She thought of the ledger, the remainder, the adjustments. At the hospital, Dr. Josef Varn reviewed the latest data. The numbers pleased him. Stability had been achieved. The anchor was holding. He signed off on the next phase without hesitation. Below him, in the secured wing, the schedule advanced to the next line. A new date. A new time. Another subtraction to maintain the illusion of renewal. And far from the city's attention, another contributor was marked complete, their code crossed out, their absence absorbed into the balance. Every renewal required a subtraction. Binding the reborn, the announcement came without ceremony. A brief statement released through official channels confirmed that Aurelian Cade was recovering beyond expectations and would soon return to public view. No details were offered, no interviews scheduled. The phrasing was clinical, restrained, designed to close curiosity rather than invite it. It did the opposite. Inside the hospital, preparation replaced treatment. The tone of the staff shifted subtly, as if the danger had passed and something more delicate had begun. Aurelian was no longer referred to as a patient. He was now an asset under observation. His chart no longer listed symptoms. It listed thresholds. Elara sensed the change the moment she entered room 7. Aurelian stood near the window, dressed in plain clothes instead of a hospital gown. He moved with a fluidity that felt unnatural, given the months of decline that had preceded his admission. His breathing was even, his posture flawless. When he turned toward her, his expression carried an ease she had not seen in years. "You look well," she said carefully. "I am stable," he replied. "That is the word they prefer." Elara stepped closer, ignoring the nurse's presence for once. "Do you feel like yourself?" Aurelian considered the question longer than necessary. "I feel aligned," he said, "as if something that was out of place has been returned to its proper position." "That does not answer me." He met her gaze, and, for a moment, the calm fractured. Something flickered beneath it. Not pain. Recognition. "They tell me not to dwell on identity," he said. "They say it introduces noise." Elara's throat tightened. "Who tells you that?" Aurelian did not answer. Instead, he extended his left hand and rolled up his sleeve. The markings were clearer now. They formed a circular impression around his wrist, faint but deliberate, as if traced repeatedly over time. Symbols intersected at precise angles, too exact to be accidental. Elara recognized the pattern from the archive image, from the chalk marking on the laboratory floor. "It appears after each session," Aurelian said. "They call it a calibration response." "It looks like a seal," Elara whispered. Aurelian lowered his sleeve. "It helps them track continuity." "Continuity of what?" He hesitated again. The pause stretched longer this time, pulling the air thin between them. "Of the bond," he said finally. That night, Elara was denied her visit without explanation. Instead, Dr. Josef Varn requested her presence in the conference room. The folder on the table was thicker than before, its edges worn as if it had been handled many times. "You have been asking questions," Varn said. "That was inevitable." "You have been taking people," Elara replied. "That was a choice." Varn did not flinch. "We have been reallocating resources." Elara's hand tightened into a fist. "You are speaking about lives." Varn folded his hands calmly. "I'm speaking about limits. The human body has them. So does influence. So does time. Palingenesis exists to negotiate those limits. You cannot negotiate death." "We are not," Varn said. "We are postponing irrelevance." He opened the folder to a page Elara had not seen before. At the top was a diagram of interlocking circles, each labeled with a designation. Anchor. Source. Cycle. The center circle bore a name. Aurelian Cade. "He is the anchor," Varn said. "Prepared over decades. Disciplined. Revered. His physiology responds predictably. His public image absorbs inconsistencies." "And the sources?" Elara asked, though she already knew. Varn did not avoid the answer. "Replaceable." Elara stood abruptly. "This ends now." Varn's expression softened, almost sympathetic. "It cannot." "Then I will expose it." Varn closed the folder. "Exposure requires leverage." "You have none." Elara thought of the ledger. "The video." the vanished villages. You are wrong. Varn regarded her with something like disappointment. Even if you speak, who will listen? A recovered icon or an unverified accusation? A living symbol or the memory of the uncounted? Alara realized then that the project did not fear truth. It feared disruption. And Aurelian was the stabilizer that prevented it. She returned home to find Aurelian already there. He stood in the living room, hands clasped behind his back, studying the familiar space, as if seeing it for the first time. The house smelled of incense she had not lit. "They released me early," he said. "The next phase does not require containment." Alara approached him slowly. "What did they do to you?" Aurelian's gaze softened. "They completed the binding." The words settled heavily between them. "What does that mean?" Alara asked. Aurelian closed his eyes. When he opened them, there was something ancient in the look that met hers. Not possession, not madness, something colder. "It means I will not deteriorate," he said. "It means I will endure." "At what cost?" He inhaled deeply. "I do not pay it alone." Alara stepped back, dread pooling in her chest. "You are still you." Aurelian nodded. "Yes. Enough to function." "And the rest?" He looked past her, toward the darkened window. "The rest has been assigned." That night, Alara dreamed of doors closing in sequence. Each time a door shut, the house grew quieter. When she woke, Aurelian was standing at the edge of the bed, fully dressed. "I have obligations now," he said. "They will call on me." "For what?" "To appear," he replied. "To reassure. To demonstrate the success of the process. And when they do," Aurelian's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile, "they will open the cycle again." Outside, sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Somewhere far from the city, another schedule advanced. Another source was prepared. Another subtraction accounted for. Alara watched the man she loved turn toward the door, aware that whatever had returned to her was not entirely his own. He was not healed. He was claimed. The price that remains. In the weeks that followed, the world accepted the return of Aurelian Cade without resistance. Images circulated of him standing tall, moving with the precision that had once defined an era. Interviews were brief and carefully framed. His words were reassuring. His presence restored confidence. The story people wanted was simple: decline reversed, discipline rewarded, science victorious. It was a story that required no footnotes. Behind the scenes, the project receded into abstraction. Doors closed. Corridors were repurposed. Schedules were archived under new designations. The language shifted from urgency to maintenance. Palingenesis became a line item rather than a headline, its machinery sustained by routine rather than revelation. Alara watched the transformation, with a clarity sharpened by loss. The man beside her was functional, composed, and admired. He fulfilled obligations with precision. He smiled when required. He endured. Yet the house was quieter now. At night, Aurelian sometimes stood by the window, listening to sounds that did not reach her. He spoke less about the future and never about the past. When Alara asked what he heard, he would answer honestly but incompletely. Fragments. Echoes. Instructions that felt older than memory. The project had succeeded in the way such systems always did. It stabilized what mattered to power. It preserved the symbol. It converted human complexity into manageable equations. The uncounted were not mourned because they were never officially lost. Records were adjusted. Villages became footnotes. Codes replaced names. No single act defined the crime. That was the design. Palingenesis did not depend on cruelty. It depended on structure, on patience, on the willingness of institutions to value continuity over conscience. It thrived not in darkness, but in the gray zones where responsibility diffused and outcomes justified methods. The anchor held, and as long as it did, the cycle would remain viable. Elara came to understand that exposure alone was insufficient. Truth required a context willing to receive it. Without that, facts dissolved into noise, and noise was easily dismissed. The project had anticipated this. It had been built not just to operate, but to survive scrutiny. There were no ceremonies for those who vanished. No markers to honor their subtraction. Their absence was absorbed into stability, their lives converted into margin. In time, another icon would falter. Another body would approach its limits. Another justification would be prepared. The cycle would reopen, dressed in new terminology, shielded by familiar assurances. Rebirth would be promised again. And somewhere, far from public view, a schedule would advance, its logic untouched by sentiment or protest. Names would be selected. Codes would be crossed out. The balance would be corrected. The file closes here, not because the story ends, but because it continues elsewhere, unobserved and uninterrupted. If rebirth demands a name, ask yourself, whose was taken to keep the door shut?